Hi guys, Mrs. Harris here. Today is Monday, April 6th. For English/reading today, we are going to do a read aloud. I'm going to read one chapter per lesson, and we are going to either do vocabulary words or we are going to do some reading comprehension questions. So today we are going to start reading the book Hatchet. And I'm going to read the synopsis, which is just a little paragraph on the back of the book that kind of gives you a little summary of what's going to happen in the book. So, 13-year-old Brian Robinson is on his way to visit his father when the single-engine plane in which he is flying crashes. Suddenly, Brian finds himself alone in the Canadian wilderness with nothing but a tattered windbreaker and the hatchet that his mother gave him as a present. And the dreadful secret that has been tearing him apart since his parents' divorce. But now Brian has no time for anger, self-pity, or despair. It will take all his know-how and determination and more courage than he ever knew he possessed to survive. So, let's figure out how Brian is going to survive this. Brian Robinson stared out the window of the plane at an endless green northern wilderness below. It was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, so roaring, and consuming and loud that it ruined any chance for conversation. Not that he had much to say, he was 13, and that the only passenger on the plane was him, and a pilot named Jim or Jake, or something like that, who was in his mid-40s, and who had been silent as he worked to prepare for takeoff. In fact, since Brian had come to the small airport in Hampton, New York, to meet the plane, driven by his mother, the pilot had only spoken 5 words to him. Get in the co-pilot seat. Which Brian had done. They had taken off, and that was the last conversation. There had been the initial excitement, of course. He had never flown in a single-engine plane before. And to be sitting in the pilot's co-pilot seat, with all the controls right there in front of him, all the instruments in his face as the plane crawled for altitude, jerking and sliding on the wind currents. As the pilot took off, as the plane took off, had been interesting and exciting, but 5 minutes in, they had leveled off at about 6,000 feet and headed northwest, and from then on, the pilot had been silent, staring out the front, and the drone of the engine had been all that was left. The drone and the sea of green trees that lay before the plane's nose and flown to the horizon, spread with lakes, swamps, and wandering streams and rivers. Now Brian sat looking out the window with the roar thundering through his ears and tried to catalog what had led up to him taking this flight. The thinking had started. Always, it started with one single word: divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought. A tearing, ugly word that meant fights and yelling and lawyers. And oh God, he hates lawyers. And how he hated lawyers who sat there with their comfortable smiles and tried to explain to him in legal terms how all that he had lived in was coming apart. And the breaking and the shattering of all the solid things. His home, his life, all the solid things. Divorce, a breaking word, an ugly word. Divorce, secrets. No, not just secrets. The secret. What he knew and had not told anybody. What he knew about his mother that had caused the divorce. What he knew. The secret. Divorce. The secret. Brian felt his eyes begin to burn and knew there would be tears. He had cried for a time, but that was gone now. He didn't cry now. Instead, his eyes burned and tears came, the seeping tears that burned, but he didn't cry. He wiped his eyes with his finger and looked at the pilot out the corner of his eye to make sure that he hadn't noticed the burning and the tears. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel, feet on the rudder pedals. He seemed more a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. On the dashboard in front of him, Brian saw the dials, switches, meters, knobs, levers, cranks, lights, handles that were wiggling and flickering, all indicating nothing that he even understood, and the pilot seemed the same way. Part of the plane, not human. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot seemed to open up a bit, and he smiled. "Ever fly in a co-pilot seat?" he asked. He leaned over and lifted his headset off his right ear and put it up on his temple, yelling to overcome the sound of the engine. Brian shook his head. He had never been in any kind of plane, never seen a cockpit of a plane except in films or television. It was loud and confusing. "It's my first time." "It's not as complicated as it looks. Good planes like this almost fly itself." The pilot shrugged. "Makes my job easy." He took Brian's left arm. "Here, put your hands on the controls, your feet on the rudder pedals, and I'll show you what I mean." Brian shook his head. "I'd better not." "Sure, try it." Brian reached out and took the wheel in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals, and the plane slewed suddenly to the right. "Not so hard. Take her light, take her light." Brian eased off, relaxed his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten momentarily as the vibrations of the plane came through the wheel and the pedals. It seemed almost alive. "See?" The pilot let go of the wheel, raised his hands in the air, and took his feet off the pedals to show Brian that he was actually flying the plane by himself. "Simple. Now turn the wheel a little to the right and push on the right rudder pedal a small amount." Brian turned the wheel slightly, and the plane immediately banked to the right. When he pressed on the right rudder pedal, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off on the pressure and straightened the wheel, and the plane righted itself. "Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little." Brian turned the wheel left, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. "It's easy," he smiled. "At least this part." The pilot nodded. "All of flying is easy. Just takes learning, like everything else, He took the controls back, then reached up and rubbed his left shoulders. "Aches and pains. Must be getting old." Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as Brian put his hands on the wheel. "Thank you." But the pilot had already put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian looking out the window at the ocean and trees and lakes. Burning eyes did not come back, but memories did. They came flooding in. The words, always the words: divorce, the secrets, the fights, the split, the big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come, and then the divorce, all so fast. And the court had left him with his mother, except for summers and what the judge called visitation rights. So formal. Brian hated judges as he hated lawyers. Judges that leaned over the bench and asked Brian if he understood where he was to live and why. Judges with the caring look that meant nothing, as lawyers said their legal phrases that mean nothing. In the summer, Brian would live with his father, in the school year with his mother. That's what the judge said after looking at the papers on his desk and listening to the lawyers talk. Talk words. Now, the plane lurched suddenly to the right, and Brian looked at the pilot. He was rubbing his shoulder again, and there was a sudden smell of body gas in the plane. Brian turned back to avoid embarrassing the pilot, who was obviously in some discomfort, must have some stomach troubles. So, this summer, the first summer, when he was allowed to have visitation rights with his father, with a divorce only 1 month old, Brian was heading north. His father was a mechanical engineer who had designed or invented a new drill bit for oil drilling, a self-cleaning, self-sharpening bit. He was working in oil fields of Canada, up on the tree line where the tundra started and the forest ended. Brian was riding up from New York with some drilling equipment. It was lashed down in the rear of the plane next to the fabric bag the pilot had called the survival pack, which had emergency supplies in case that they had to make an emergency landing that had to be specially made in the city. Riding in the bush plane with a pilot named Jim, Jake, or something, who had turned out to be an all right guy, letting him fly and all. Except for the smell. Now there was a constant odor, and Brian took another look at the pilot. Found him rubbing his shoulder and down his arm now, the left arm, letting go more gas and wincing, probably something he ate, Brian thought. His mother had driven him from the city to meet the plane at Hampton, where it came to pick him up and the drilling equipment. A drive in silence. A long drive in silence. 2.5 hours of sitting in the car, staring out the window of the plane. Once after an hour, when they were out of the city, she turned to him. Look, can we talk this over? Can we talk this out? Can you tell me what is bothering you? And there were the words again. Divorce, split, the secret. How could he tell her what he knew? So he had to remain silent, shook his head, and continued to stare unseeingly at the countryside, and his mother had gone back to driving, only to speak to him one more time whenever they were close to Hampton. She reached over the back seat and brought up a paper sack. I got you something for your trip. Brian looked at the sack, opened the top. Inside there was a hatchet, the kind with the steel handle and a rubber hand grip. The head was in a stout leather case that had a brass riveted belt loop. It goes on your belt. His mother spoke now without looking at him. There were some farm trucks on the roads now, and she had to weave through them and watch traffic. The man at the store said that you could use it, you know, in the woods with your father. Dad, he thought. Not my father, my dad. Thanks, it's really nice. But the words sounded hollow, even to Brian. Try it on. See how it looks on your belt. And normally he would have said no. Would normally have said no. It looks too hokey to have a hatchet on my belt. Those were the normal things he would say. But her voice was thin, had a sound like something thin that would break if you touched it. And he felt bad for not speaking to her, knowing what he knew, even with the anger, the hot white hate of his anger at her. He still felt bad for not speaking to her, and so he humored her. He loosened his belt and pulled the right side out and put the hatchet on his belt. Scooch around so we can see it. He moved around in the seat, feeling slightly ridiculous. She nodded, just like a scout, my little scout. And there was the tenderness in her voice that she had whenever I was small. The tenderness that she had when he was small and sick with a cold. And she put her hand on his forehead. and the burning came into his eyes again, and he had turned away from her and looked out the window, forgetting about the hatchet on his belt, and so arrived at the plane with the hatchet still on his belt. Because it was a bush flight from a small airport, there had been no security, and the plane had been waiting with the engine running whenever he had arrived, and he had grabbed his suitcase and packed bag and run for the plane without stopping to remove the hatchet. So it was still on his belt. At first, he had been embarrassed, but the pilot had said nothing about it. And Brian forgot it as they took off and began flying. More smell now. Bad. Brian turned again to glance at the pilot and both hands on his stomach, grimacing in pain, reaching for his left shoulder again. As Brian watched, "Don't know, kid." The pilot's words were a hiss barely audible. "Bad aches here, bad aches. Thought it was something I ate, but..." He stopped as a fresh spasm of pain hit him. Even Brian could see how bad it was. The pain drove the pilot back into his seat, back and down. "I've never had anything like this." The pilot reached for the switch on his mic cord, his hand coming up in a small arc from his stomach. And he flipped the switch and said, "This is flight 446. And now a jolt took him like a hammer blow, so forcefully that he seemed to crush back into the seat. And Brian reached for him, could not understand at first what it was. He would not be able to know. But then he knew. Brian knew. The pilot's mouth went rigid. He swore and jerked a short series of slams into the seat, holding onto his shoulder now. Swore and hissed, "Chest! Oh my God, my chest is coming apart." Brian knew now. The pilot was having a heart attack. Brian had been in the shopping mall with his mother when a man in front of the Paisley store had suffered a heart attack. He had gone down and screamed about his chest, an old man, much older than the pilot. Brian knew. The pilot was having a heart attack. And even as the knowledge came to Brian, he saw the pilot slam into his seat one more time. One more awful time, he slammed back into his seat. His right leg jerked, pulling the plane to the side in a sudden twist. And his head fell forward and spit came. Spit came from the corners of his mouth. And his legs contracted up into his seat. And his eyes rolled back into his head until there were only white for his eyes, and the smell became worse. It filled the cockpit, and all of it so fast, so incredibly fast, that Brian's mind could not take it at first, could only see it in stages. The pilot had been talking just moments ago, complaining of the pain. He had been talking. Then the jolts had come. The jolts that took the pilot back had come, and now Brian sat there, was a strange feeling of silence in the thrumming roar of the engine. A strange feeling of silence and being alone. Brian was stopped. He was stopped inside. He could not think past what he saw, what he felt. All was stopped. The very core of him, the very center of Brian Robinson was stopped. A striking with a white flash of horror. A terror so intense that his breathing, his thinking, and nearly heart had stopped. Seconds passed. Seconds became all of his life. And he began to know that what he was seeing, began to understand what he saw. And that was so much worse. So much worse that he wanted to make his mind freeze again. He was sitting in a bush plane, roaring 7,000 feet above the northern wilderness, with a pilot who suffered a massive heart attack and who either was dead or in something close to a coma. He was alone in the roaring plane with no pilot. He was alone. alone. So that is the end of chapter 1. It was a pretty intense start. So, brief overview. Brian gets on a plane, going to see his dad for the summer because his mom and dad got a divorce. So he's with his mom during the school year, his dad during the summer. His dad works in Canada, working in the oil fields. And now Brian is noticing that the pilot is having a heart attack. So the next reading lesson, we will pick up with the second chapter. For this chapter, I want you guys to do some comprehension questions. And I'm just going to read them to you real quick. Number 1, where is Brian going? So he gets on a plane. He's flying towards Canada. Where is he going? Number 2, why is Brian not speaking to his mom? What leads up to him being angry with his mom? Number 3, what did Brian's mom give him on the drive up to the airplane? So what did he attach to his belt? What happened to the pilot as they flew towards Canada? He was grabbing his arm in some pain, but what was the final outcome? And how did Brian know that the pilot was having a heart attack? So I just want you guys to answer those 5 questions. I sent those to you guys in an email. If you have any questions, let me know. If not, we will pick up on Wednesday with chapter 2. All right, guys, have a good day. Bye.